Ja, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde von Günther Uecker und liebe Freunde der Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen, ich bin sehr froh, Sie heute zu dem Abend im Schmälerhaus zu begrüßen, begleitend zur Günther Uecker-Ausstellung. Und wir sind sehr, sehr glücklich, dass Valerie Hillings zugesagt hat, den weiten Weg der Reise auf sich zu nehmen und heute Abend bei uns zu sprechen. Now I switch to English. Valerie, I'm very, very happy that you followed our invitation. So we have been a bit, I don't know, we didn't want to ask you first because we know you're so busy and it's a long way. But we admired so much your curatorial work at the Guggenheim, New York, to create the Zero exhibition. Many of the people who are here have seen this exhibition. And so, because for our exhibition in the K20, from the beginning on, with Stefanie Jansen and me, it was so important for us to stress this international reception of Günther Uecker. In the early years, so in the 50s already, he exhibited in so many countries worldwide. And then in the later years, you know, he exhibited in almost 60 years of the world. So it was important for us to stress these impact on the cultures, different cultures worldwide of Günther Uecker. And yes, so we are very happy that you came over to Düsseldorf to speak tonight. And I want to give a short introduction to Valerie Hillings. So she's since 2004 a member of the curatorial staff at Guggenheim, New York. But she curated exhibitions in all the Guggenheim museums. So Deutsche Guggenheim in Berlin and Bilbao and Hermitage. And now she is, you may know it, she's director of the new Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. So your official title is curator and manager. It's a bit unusual for us, but you're responsible for the new concept of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, which will be opened. This is the public information in 2017, we will see. And the biggest Guggenheim building which we have till now, the architect is Frank Gehry, and it makes us very curious to read your cultural vision of the new museum, because you described it as a very new model of museum, something like I don't know, I understood it like a synthesis of an approach to global art, so a transcultural vision in a way. Perhaps you will give a comment to this in your lecture, or we can discuss it later. And you're always specialized in arts of other cultures, Middle Eastern art, and you are part of the Zero Foundation scientific board. You did your PhD thesis in New York, the university, in Artistry, Institute of Fine Arts. You focused on modern and post-war art, and with concentrations in Russian art and Western European art of the 50s and 60s. When we traveled to New York, Mr. and Mrs. Rademacher and many of the friends of Uecker, we were so impressed by the special atmosphere in the building of the Guggenheim, because, Frank Lloyd Wright realized it between 56 and 59. 59 it was opened. And so it's the same time of the early works of Uecker and Zero. And to see this as a Gesamtkunstwerk, to see this exhibition in this building was really very unexpectedly exciting. And this exhibition was selected as I think the most successful exhibitions of the year in the United States. And we could feel when we have been there how the young people, the young audience, have been very interested to for the first time really to get in contact with the Zero art. And yes, so I think it's enough for a comment, because we want to listen to you. But so we are very curious to hear your lecture and what you're telling us on Zero and the international reception. Thank you so much, Valerie.
Thank you. It's very exciting to see a lot of people I know in the audience and unfamiliar faces. Thank you very much for that introduction, and also to K20 for inviting me to be a part of the program organized in conjunction with this magnificent Günther Uecker exhibition that has really sensitively been curated by Marianne Ackermann and Stephanie Jensen in collaboration with the artist. I think that's something we have in common, wanting to be together with the artist in these journeys. I'm also struck by the various ways in which you've shown us the diversity in Uecker's oeuvre, and at the same time mapped out how his art and the artist himself have traveled through time and space. And that's something I'm going to try to address tonight. There's a kind of reciprocity with him, an acceptance of influences, but also a transmission of influence. And I think this is, again, something I hope I'll come to tonight. With this in mind, I thought it would be interesting to start with a personal anecdote. I always try, it's going to be a little academic here in the middle, so I thought I'd start with that. When I was working on my doctoral thesis, which was on artist groups in Europe in the 50s and 60s, one chapter was on Zero, and I had made a commitment with my different fellowships to come to Germany for a given period, and it just so happened that Günther Uecker was in Vietnam the whole time. So already from the beginning of my life with Uecker, I understood that he was always on the go, and it made a lot of sense to me that he would really, you know, I would not know where I would encounter him. And in fact, I finally met him years later in New York, which is actually perfect because that's where our two histories converge. And I began a conversation a number of years back that is ongoing. We had a long conversation last night that I hope will feed into today. But I've been struck, as you probably are, about the journey you take when you become engaged with him and his work. In our first early conversations, we found ourselves talking about Azerbaijan. We have a common friend there, who knew? Talking about his recent projects in Iran and Cuba. I was taken on a journey that I may not be able to go on because of my passport. So thank you, Günther, for that introduction. But really, above all, he's a citizen of the world, constantly moving through it and engaging with many sources. So tonight, I'm going to actually, as I'll explain, I'm going to divide this talk into the history and the present. Uecker and his contemporaries in the late 50s and 60s laid the groundwork for the art world we have today, where interconnections. Actually, I'm going to give you an image of him to look at rather than my boring title. I like him in this corner. He's never in the corner. He's always on top of it. So there you have it. In the art world today, interconnections and cross-continental projects are the norm. Current terms such as transnational and transcultural emanate from this watershed decade. At least that's what we're beginning to argue as art historians and curators. Art historically speaking, exhibitions have been providing a very fruitful framework for many of us to examine new ideas and new labels that emerged in the crucible of the 1960s. Breaking with the past, even as artists reconnected with and contended with the lineage of the historic avant-garde of the early 20th century. Tonight, I too am aiming, as I said, to look backwards and forwards into the past and our present. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to examine the key years of 1959 to 1965, tracing Uecker's participation in many of the most important and defining exhibitions of the period. I will then speak briefly about his impact on subsequent generations of artists, focusing tonight on three contemporary artists, Hassan Sharif, Mona Hatoum, and Mohammad Kazem. Already in the mid-1950s, and I was just saying I had to start with this work because it's always been an icon for me, and I had the great pleasure of looking at it every day for 3 months. So thank you to everybody who made that possible. Already by the mid-1950s, Uecker had left home and started to travel, including outside of Germany. In France, he met the artists Armand and Yves Klein, with whom Uecker found common cause both personally and professionally. In his work of the late 1950s, such as this iconic work, The Yellow Picture, already we see points of connection to others, the decision to investigate single-color painting, the use of everyday materials, but also the beginnings of Uecker's personal journey to evolve his signature vocabularies, and of course, his signature use of the nail as an art material. To be sure, a major part of his lexicon is the nail, but so too is the very physical aspect of the creation of his work and the ways in which a seemingly abstract work can be an instrument of contemplation of larger concepts and other histories. In 1959, Uecker hosted a party here in Oberkassel with Jean Tinguely's, around the time of Jean Tinguely's first one-man show in Gallery Schmela, sort of a fitting reference to bring in this Not that, there wasn't this building, but in this building nevertheless. Amazingly, this party spanned 3 days, and it found the artist transforming his space into blue and red monochromatic backdrops for live music and dancing. The Rheinische Post covered the event, which is quite interesting, referring to Uecker as the blue man of the house, and noting that Yves Klein was wearing a blue disc on his head, on a headband. Tanguy also was obviously running around, and we were just talking, Günther Uecker and myself, about red and blue. I said, "Why red and blue?" And we were just talking. He was talking to me about, and it's great to have the yellow on the screen. These different colors that in the spectrum that converge to become white, the white of light. So. But of course, I'm sure for those at the party, they were really thinking about that great dancing and music. But anyway, I think it was very fitting when the paper talked about this particular event. They referred to its multinational character. They said 3 nights long they danced with Uecker in Oberkassel. French, Germans, Swiss. Bohemians? To be sure, this occasion illustrated that Uecker was among those here in Düsseldorf who could convene colleagues from different countries. And I think as we go through tonight, we're going to see how that happened. Less than 2 months after that famous party, and I'm just showing you here when Yves and Jean Tanguy were here in Düsseldorf, just to remind ourselves. Less than 2 months later, these were 2 of the artists, among others, who found themselves hitting the road, as it were, to Antwerp, Belgium, where a group of artists known as G58 held an exhibition in their alternative space, the theme of the exhibition being movement. This alternative space had been the 2nd floor of a port storehouse, and a pretty large space, more than 1,300 square meters. The members of the G58 held exhibitions there, debates, film screenings, and performances of experimental theater and music. And in talking to many different artists, they were so happy to make sure that we knew that Antwerp was a center. And I think that's something that also emerges, is that while everybody thinks of Paris and New York, there were a lot of other centers, Düsseldorf included, in this moment that start to become really key for the avant-garde of the post-war history. As the art historian Johann Paas has noted, the show started out to be a reconception and expansion of the historic 1955 exhibition Le Mouvement, held at the Galerie Denis René in Paris, which is often seen as a launching point for what historically has been termed kinetic art. Paul Barry, who you actually, I believe, yes, you can see in this image, Paul Barry had been in that original historic exhibition, Le Mouvement. He had also had a one-man show in the Hessenhuis at that time, and reached out to his colleagues Tanguy, who was then in Düsseldorf, as we just saw, and Jesus Rafael Soto, who was based in Paris, and started to talk about what this new show on movement could be. Over time, it came into focus as being about a younger generation. And so the artists such as Robert Brier, Yves Klein, Heinz Mock, Bruno Minari, Otto Pina, Dieter Roth, Daniel Spurri, Tanguy, and of course Uecker were among those that you see in these installation views. I think it's always really great to plunge you into this visual landscape, and I think we've been talking, for me, this was the dream I had for my exhibition, was to start you in this space, and that was the very first gallery of the show. But I mean, it was the first gallery of a zero show, but really it's not zero here. So I want to stress that this is a prehistory. This is a starting point for a generation and for a group of artists, but not under a particular title. Although that said, there obviously was an exhibition title. And so while it started out with the Belgian version of movement, all of a sudden, after the exhibition catalog introduction introduced the term vision in motion, motion in vision, a term taken from Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's posthumously published book, this became the instant history of the show. And so I think, it was very fitting, of course, to look back to Moholy-Nagy's thinking when he had proclaimed in 1922, along with Alfred Kemeny, "We must therefore replace the static principle of classical art with the dynamic principle of universal life." In that book, he also called for an end to humanity's inclination to cling to the past, a very fitting notion for this generation, the generation that coming out of World War II wanted to look forward and not backward, and to imagine freedom as a possibility, for the freedom to invent, to create, to reimagine. I think what's important in this installation, which you see very clearly here, is it had the effect, at least visually, of downplaying the individual. Everything starts to fuse and merge. Juxtapositions happen. I think in the bottom image you see in the front the Jesus Rafael Soto, but in the other two images you certainly see Günther Uecker's work. In the bottom left, you're seeing this wonderful work, Symmetrical Structure. What really kind of emerged for all of them is that, and I remember speaking with Günther Uecker about this, is that it was an aha moment for the generation. They really understood. They didn't all know each other. They didn't know each other's work. And suddenly to see that somebody was making something that had so much kinship, it might not be the same thing, but there was structure. There was this interest in light. There was an interest in having the viewer activated on some level. All of this sort of, I think you could say, came into focus through Vision in Motion in a really interesting and profound way. But of course, one of the really fascinating and fabulous things that Uecker showed is this beautiful little nail tree that you see seated it's on the floor in this case, displayed on the floor. So there were different languages from each of the artists. They were finding their way, but certainly I think this set the tone for who some of these people would be and began a process of interconnection and relationship building that emanates from 59. And that's why I said I'm going to start with 59, even though I cheated a little bit by showing some of the pictures that predate that. And I think also it's interesting to show you the Soto. I mean, on the one hand, Symmetrical Structure is more single colored. It has the nail structuring, but I think, the use of another material in relationship to a support surface, there's just that commonality. And I think I can't really imagine what that moment must have meant or felt like for the artists. Really from that point forward, from 59 forward, exhibition opportunities begin to happen. The other thing also to say about Vision in Motion is some of the artists' work really look different, like the interactive Dieter Roth in the top, the auto theater of Daniel Spurry, and of course the infamous empty space left behind after the opening night by Yves Klein. There was kind of this incredible impulse to reach out. So I think that's really begins to manifest in exhibitions. The first of the really key exhibitions in many ways, although I'm sure other historians would argue differently, was Monochrome Amalur I, an exhibition curated by Udo Kultermann, then the director of Museum Schloss Morsbroek in Leverkusen. He had been engaged for a period of time with this wider group of artists and was really interested, of course, as everybody began to be from 57 on, this testing of the single color. What did it mean to be painting a single color? What could it look like? Here I'm showing you what I believe to be the piece that Günther Uecker showed. It was certainly, there were two Whitefield pieces listed in the catalog, and I think, again, there's this concentration of nails in the middle, so already the language of that process is changing and evolving. But it is interesting because this exhibition, it opened in March of 1960. It brought together 40 artists, and they came from France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Romania, the Soviet Union, Spain, and the United States. So it was very wide-ranging in terms of the artists participating, and also in terms of what the work looked like. So if you have a work like this, there was also this work by Francesco Lo Savio, who interestingly, I actually spent a period of time living in the studio with Uecker. So I think, you really these different translations, some that are perhaps more traditional, some that are readily, but a lot of them are all, of course, relating to a principle of light. And so that wasn't the title of the show, but the show really begins to take a very simple term, a term that's in currency, a term that's perhaps literal, and opens it up. And I think that that was an important moment. I think everybody looks back at that moment as very defining. In the period when Monochrome Amalur I is opening, the Swiss artist Max Bill actually came to see Günther Uecker and speak with him about his forthcoming, actually June 1960. So a lot of things are happening very quickly. Exhibition Konkrete Kunst, and it really, the subtitle refers to 50 years of development, and it was in Zurich's Helmhaus. This particular show had 114 artists from 3 generations. So on the one hand, these first couple of exhibitions are largely looking at a new generation, but then there begins to be this twist of how can we relate things on a continuum? How can we look at multiple countries? And so in Bill's case, he was invested in locating contemporary art within a history that that sort of really begins in 1930 when the Dutch artist Theo van Doesburg coins the term concrete art, and concrete being used as an alternative to abstract. In the single-issue journal Art Concret AC, he defined concrete art as painting entirely conceived and formulated before its execution, constructed of purely plastic elements, devoid of references to nature, lyricism, symbolism, and the unconscious, and with no signification beyond itself. And I think that that's a really, and actually also analogizing art to a typewritten page instead of a handwritten page. And in the context of 1959-60, that definitely related to how artists were thinking about art. They were really against the personal signature of Taschism, this investment of this kind of, existential crisis on canvas. And in fact, that kind of art had been very much on display in Documenta too. And so Bill had that in common with artists like Uecker and others who were saying, I want to do something a bit different. But what that different didn't mean leaving behind many of those things that were sort of ruled out by the definition of art concret. But here you see the catalog, you see the picture of Uecker's work in it, and I think to be in the company of so many people as such a young artist at that point had to have been quite interesting and important, and at the same time, perhaps a bit, I imagine, as it is for most artists still today, a bit baffling to suddenly find yourself under all these different labels. Am I a monochrome painter? Am I a concrete artist? Am I vision in motion? And I think it's a challenge that stays with all of us. What are the labels that can make sense? How can we curatorially, as people, begin to put this picture together? And I think it's important at that same time because it was just a sort of wide open. And another term that gets put out at the time is the new conception of art, which is a title of an exhibition and a issue of the magazine that Piero Manzoni and Enrico Castellani produced, the magazine Azimuth and the gallery Azimuth. Uecker was in that show, I believe, and I think so. What does new conception mean? What is that new conception? And I think at the same time, a really important thing that happened, a related term, was an exhibition that was held in Zagreb, then Yugoslavia, Nove Tendencije, which actually comes out of the Konkrete Kunst because Almir Mavigné, a Brazilian-born artist who's been resident in Hamburg for many decades, had come to Germany to study with Max Bill at the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm and happened, like Uecker and others, to be moving around. And he met Matko Mestrovitz, a still wonderfully living curator-critic, and he, together with Radoslav Putar and also the artist Ivan Pitzel, conceived this exhibition that was originally, they were tossing around titles, they were thinking about it being about concrete art, and of course, being Brazilian, Almir was advocating for the Brazilians to be in it, but it didn't quite work out that way. And so the show that you're seeing, Installation Views, opened in August of 1961 with 29 artists, among them Uecker, and I think in the upper right picture on the side, you can see one of his nail reliefs hanging there on the wall in a sort of shadow box. And so, but just looking at this, you have a smoke picture by Pina. You have on the bottom one of Tallmann's pieces where you would move the balls with your hands. The bottom right, you have an Uli Pohl piece. So these are all the artists that we start to think of as Zero, certainly, and moving into 1961. That's starting to take a certain form, but they're still very individual. And what was an interesting outcome of this exhibition is that there was also another generation, so to speak, that was emerging in Paris around the Galerie Denise René with Victor Vasarely's son, Ivaral. He was connecting with other artists from Latin America, most particularly Julio Laparque and others, to form the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel. So they were a really strong force in this exhibition, and many of them came out of a position of very strong Marxist and socialist politics, and they also, being younger, they wanted to begin to define themselves. So New Tendencies, plural, is very wide open, but very quickly they took that and they changed the term to Nouvelle Tendance Recherche Continuelle, the name of a new movement. And at first they start talking about artists like Uecker and his colleagues as being inside this new phenomenon, but the phenomenon was very much about structure, about teamwork, erasure, extreme erasure of individuality, which certainly Uecker was not known for, nor would he have been in that moment. And so in 1963, there's an act of an act of exclusion, if you will. It was almost like I believe John Anthony Thwaites talked about an excommunication. Well, Günther Uecker was on that list, and the reasoning was given was no clarity of position. I don't know that he's ever been accused of that ever since, but that was certainly within this context of new tendencies. I think it was probably not a bad thing that happened. But these kinds of rigid definitions, because they really didn't encapsulate what he was doing, and you can really see that. When you look at everything in the beginning of the 60s. So a key opportunity that came actually just a bit before that new tendency show was his inclusion in the exhibition Bevog en Beweging that opens, as you see with the poster, in March of 1961 at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and it ultimately went on to the Moderne Museet and Louisiana Museum. So a multi-venue show conceived, like Le Mouvement before it, as bringing together historic pioneers and contemporary artists, addressing real and virtual movement. In the accompanying catalog, it included artists' writings and an essay by Carl Pontus Hulten, with whom Uecker was friendly at the time. The text served to suggest a lengthy history and an international scope. So again, there was a kind of conscious desire to make sure that this notion of an international avant-garde lived on into the 60s, and that it was seen to have roots in the early 20th century. Uecker presented one of his nail works, Light Field, which you see here. And really, what I really appreciate, and it's in the current exhibition, is the film, which he turned me on to from 1961, where, like this image, you begin to see light moving across the surface, and you understand it's not just about a white panel with nails on it, not at all. It is an instrument for other things, for light, for movement, and that by extension, these more immaterial concepts that are suggested. And then what happens is, of course, this is a particular title of an exhibition, but really this is sort of another launch point for what begins to be known as a light and movement or kinetic art or op art movement. And these are all labels that come a bit later in the 60s, but this is sort of the emanating point. But I want to return to this pivotal time of 1960 and 61 because I think what's really important, and something that I think gets captured very well in the exhibition here, is his really important engagement with action and with these kind of the physicality of creating. And so the arrow shooting pictures of 1960 really strike me, and I've been thinking so much about these sort of ostensibly destructive techniques and how they really created something new, and also the way he was using his body to define some of the measurements in his work, to define how a work was created. And I think it's interesting. It's around the same time, thinking of the International, that Niki de Saint-Phalle was making her tear pictures, and granted with a rifle, but there are these different things happening in circles that are very much interconnected. But of course, when we think of action, we certainly think, and especially being here, I think of it in 1961 in July when Uecker joined the activities of Zero Edition Demonstration Exposition and put the white paint, as you see him here, out in front of the Galerie Schmela. Just prior to this time in 1958, he had been in the 7th evening exhibition in the studio of Mock and Pina called The Red Picture, but really had been doing his own thing, and that's what we've been seeing. He was weaving in and out of the circles, but it was at this event where his history really begins to collide with that of Mock and Pina within the context of Zero. But here, what I think is amazing, he transformed the urban world of the street at a very early moment. We think of a lot of street actions coming, okay, maybe 63, but certainly later into the 60s, closing in on 1968. But he really made it a site of artistic activity, filling the space with white paint. Using white at the time was obviously, as we've seen, in line with the practice, so many of the works were white, and also connected to some of the artists he admired from the early avant-garde, such as Malevich and Stravinsky. Ostensibly a simple gesture, Uecker's decision to literally paint the town in front of a live audience echoed his statement in Zero, the 3rd issue of the Zero magazine. Quote, "Immediate experience comes only when we ourselves participate. To obtain widest participation, the production of art must cease to be limited to the individual, as has been till now," unquote. So for him, the white zone, which is, you see a lot of people present in it, it created this condition for enabling a new form of artistic expression to emerge. And then on the right, and also back into that spirit of fun and participation, you see him getting ready to help with hot air to fill air into a balloon that was designed by his friend at the time, Van Alpen. And I didn't bring the picture of the balloon, but this it does, of course, launch into the night sky, beginning to be part of this ending point, I think, in a way, of this demonstration. From that point onwards, as I said, he becomes obviously very engaged with the activities of Zero and this wider network that sort of comes together in the 1960s. That action that I was just showing kind of gets a little bit reconstituted in Arnhem with the Dutch artists, with Henk Peters and others of the Nul group, and Peters really takes the lead, but with a lot of input from the colleagues that he knew, to bringing the art of these artists into a major museum, particularly in this case the Stedelijk Museum. There's a lot been written about that show, about what all the circumstances were, and someday we're going to really bring it all together. But in the meantime, I can say that it opened on March 9th, 1962, and it only ran for 13 days. So it was very quick, although that was kind of the way. An art historian, Anton Mellison, has recently noted that a confluence of circumstances, including a gap in the museum's calendar, and the artist's willingness to pay for costs, including shipping and the publication, are ultimately what made that exhibition possible. Nevertheless, it was an important historic watershed moment with an international roster of 24 participants, including Uecker. And this really began to introduce, importantly, the work of the Dutch artists such as Jan Hendrikse's, this is his bottle wall that I showed in New York. Hendrikse was Uecker was so key for him. He got him over. He had him, over here in Germany. Jan speaks so tellingly of how important that dialogue was, and I think that was an important thing, that we who are lucky enough to speak to these living artists, we hear of those conversations, but those conversations led to a philosophy of art that maybe manifested in different ways. On the bottom, the work of Christian Meggerd, who very recently I think had a show here in town, merging art and life into the space of his mirror pieces. In the case of Günther Uecker, his work was exhibited in a gallery that was more or less Zero Gallery, where you can see his work here blended with that of Mach and Pina. But really showing these kind of signature objects, these white works covered in nails. One of the work, and you see, what I think is interesting here is, if you, from a distance, when you see some of the views, even though they're on pedestals, they almost seem to be floating in space. And this is another example of a work that was in the show. But the column is really fascinating to me because it is sort of this beginning point of the everyday object that becomes a signature part of his work by 1963-4. Those kinds of objects are like his television sets and the tables, such as the one in K20's collection that's on view currently. In this context, this kind of fusion, there is a dialogue about light, there is a dialogue about these shared principles. In January of 1963, and it's not an image on the screen, but in January of 63, Mach, Pina, and Uecker had their first major museum exhibition together in the Museum Haus Lange in Krefeld, which just 2 years earlier had a retrospective of Yves Klein. Paul Wember, the museum's director, wrote the catalog essay celebrating Group Zero's achievements and citing as a proof of that their inclusion in Vision in Motion, Befogen Beweging, and 062, calling particular attention to their development of art focused on light and movement. But 63 is important for that, but really 1964 begins to be, I think, a really watershed moment. It marks the first presentations outside of the Dutch, French, and German and Italian-speaking countries of Zero, but that's not to say, in Uecker's case, he had already shown in certain other places. We were talking the other night, I believe, that there was a show in 1960 in Taipei. So we're going to be thinking. Now I'm not narrowing him out, but bringing focus back into a more Zero area. So the two shows happen in London at the New Vision Centre in McRoberts and Tunnard, and really basically at the same moment, there's Documenta 3. Uecker had been chosen early on for Aspecta 1964, the fourth section of Documenta 3, where it was spotlighting young artists of the generation and putting him together with the likes of Lee Bontekoe, Leon Golub, Jasper Johns, Ellsworth Kelly, Morris Lewis, Larry Rivers, and then the kind of more known Europeans of Paul Bury, Almir Mavini, who I mentioned, and Piero d'Orazio. The section focused on contemporary developments, incorporated light and movement, but it didn't actually include Mach and Pina, and Uecker intervened with Arnold Bode, and Licht und Bewegung section began to be formulated quite last minute, resulting in the installation you see here, which was comprised of 7 works, most individually made by either Mach, Pina, or Uecker. And I have to show you this amazing image. I was always so struck because we're also used to the light discs being on the floor, but here it's on the wall. And that together, there were 2 pieces made together, which are the 2 on the end here, where Uecker put his nails into these different everyday objects that were then topped with moving rotors in the language of Heinz Mach, and the lights through perforations, which was the language of Otto Pina. So this is really a pinnacle moment. The light and movement, if there is one, begins to really take off from this point, giving birth to other exhibitions. But in parallel and importantly, being recognized on the stage of Documenta signaled a very important place for those artists, I would argue, within the international avant-garde so conceived. Really, again, almost in parallel, there's a 1964 exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in the University of Pennsylvania, which was the only major museum survey of zero until the Guggenheim show 50 years later, in the US, to be clear. But at the same time, there had been 2 gallery shows in the Howard Wise Gallery, On the Move, and then the Group Zero show, of 2 images of which I'm showing you. And I was always so struck, in fact, completely thrilled by this photo, which you do have in the exhibition, because the picture happens effectively 2 or 3 months at the most, I think, after the Beatles landed in JFK to much fanfare as the British invasion. So I think of this as the German invasion, and it's just a fantastic thing that the Lufthansa jet behind them. But what it really tells me is I think of the early history, of Günther Uecker and others jumping in their cars and going all over Europe. I kept saying, they would say, well, it was a Fiat size or a VW size, and then they might get on the train, and I'm thinking, how are they crossing borders with these things? But then by 64, in the jet era, it's possible to make that leap, and the leap, whether we like that phrase or not, New York had become somewhat the center of the art world. So it was a very interesting moment, a kind of cataclysmic moment in many ways, because in 64, there's London, there's Documenta, there's New York. All these things are happening, and it's a very exciting opportunity. And I remember reading Uecker talking about how suddenly one could sell the work, could possibly make a living from the work, and things were really starting to shift, and people wanted to hear from these individuals. But in 1965, the artist returned for a reprise game of the Newell show in the Stedelijk Museum. This time, it had a little bit of a longer run and included more than 30 artists. And so this is the kind of famous photo. Although I have to admit, after some research for our exhibition, we realized I'm being guilty in repeating it. Soto was not in that picture. You sort of see him above Otto Pina. That's actually photomontaged in. So the actual original photo, he wasn't in the picture, but he was in the exhibition. So I'm being a little bit guilty of repeating that same error. Really, what was so interesting is here the scope went even wider, having works, of course, here you see the collision of works by members of the Gutai group in Japan who were really earlier artists and doing some of the same things, shown in juxtaposition with Yves Klein, and then the Dutch Newell artists on the bottom with this water ceiling and Schoonhoven's great reliefs. And then of course this really kind of iconic work by Yayoi Kusama, who I remember sort of going to her retrospective recently and seeing her tables with the accumulations and so on, and all I could think of was Günther Uecker, because this kind of outgrowth of these materials that attach themselves, if you will, to the everyday object. There's such a kinship, and so this piece was in that exhibition, and in the exhibition, Uecker presented what for me is one of the most wonderful works that he made. This is one of the 3 New York dancers that I'm very proud we've acquired for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, so that's why I raised that banner high. But in any case, having been in New York, in many of the artist's works, in Günther Uecker's work, we see that time and again, he has homages. He references both the historic and the contemporary that he's looking at. Well, here the homage is clearly to that city, to the energy of that city, and to also the love of dance. I mean, we started talking about 1959 dancing 3 days in a row. That's pretty fantastic. So 3 dancers, let's give you the historic view of it. 3 dancers were placed within the gallery, really consisting of a piece of cloth draped over steel rods and with the long nails facing out. There are a couple of them on view here now in the K20, so go see them if you haven't. And it really is, I had asked him, it was really the only truly anthropomorphic works that he was making in the 60s. And they reflected his goal at the time, and I've been lucky to speak with him about this, to transfer human behavior onto kinetic sculptures. At rest, they have the appearance of a limp, ghost-like figure. It's quite, especially, let's go back to this one, that helps. But when set in motion, the work's rhythmic oscillation and the jarring yet hypnotic soundtrack of the clanking nails suggests the physical abandon of both secular dance and religious ritual, of the kind of Sufi whirling that we think about, or at least I think about often. Uecker regarded them as the embodiment of the contradictions in society at the time. So here we really begin to see emerging in this sort of moment the social dimension, or the kind of engagement with history, the engagement with society. And on the one hand, they represented for him the activation of a burgeoning youth culture. And on the other hand, the limitations, the political limitations, because he said that it can dance and it can move, but it's bounded by the amount of distance it can turn on its axis. But they're dancing on the erupting volcano of life for him. And I think that, but what's so interesting is the concept of freedom, which is something I've talked about with him a lot, is really embedded in this work. The freedom to do, the freedom to not do, and also asking the dependence on the viewer to activate the piece to begin with. So I see this as a moment where the work is living on that border between the actions and the objects. This is a map that we devised for the Zero show, so I just threw it in here to kind of summarize as I begin to twist us out of this maybe what one might think of as the Zero period. I mean, this is just some of the places where major activity happened, where artists were positioned. So imagine Günther Uecker was moving among these and other places, including Taipei. Pretty big world out there for a beginning of a career. By 1966, Zero had its last joint exhibition in Bonn, Zero in Bonn. It opened in November at the Städtische Kunstsammlung in Bonn. And it's amazing how quickly from 64 that things started to happen for the individuals. It was only a year and a half, well, in 1966, it was a year and a half after another important large-scale survey of Machpine and Uecker mounted by the Kästner Gesellschaft Hanover, which similarly to some of the earlier exhibitions brought together their major bodies, which was really important because there was a chance, as we have now today, to see a great kind of body of work, to see what had been achieved, but also imagine how young they were to have such major representations. Anyway, as noted in the Zero in Bonn catalog's introduction, by that point, by 1966, Group Zero and its individual participants had attained an important place within the new art history, as it was called. But really, by the close of that show, the decision, or actually by the announcement of that show, the decision had been made that truly everybody was going to go their separate ways. And so, even if 64 already there's a separation, 66 is really a page closing. And I think it's very interesting that right before the Bonn show opens, Uecker opens this very important solo show in the Howard Wise Gallery. And I love this picture. I also love the picture that's in the vitrine over at the museum where Kusama is standing in the garden in her kimono. There's also some great shots of just her. But I think it's a really important moment from the 62 onwards. Also the environmental aspect of the work attaches. And so here you have, on the one hand, this incredible Zen impulse that is always underlying much of what Günther Uecker does, and then this kind of almost threat of danger, right? How are you going to walk through this thing? And thinking at that moment, someone like Carl Andre is just putting metal pieces onto the floor that you can walk on. It's a very different aesthetic. It's a very different engagement. And in that same show, he's showing this piece, Light Rain, that you have here on view in K20, which I have to admit I just saw for the first time today and was incredibly struck about this idea of navigation, of walking through the space of light, the physical relationship. I mean, really, the measurements of these things begin to make you very aware of your body. And certainly I know he was thinking about that in his work. This piece is dated to 1970, but by the late 1960s, he begins to really move into these other materials. And I think, it's been argued many places that 68 is a really big pivot in the work. And I think all of us are taken with the series of sand mills, such as the one currently in the exhibition. I felt it was very important. I called it the Zen garden of the Zero Show, that you went through everything to get to this moment with the work. But what I've been fascinated by thinking about Uecker's work is, and you see it again, if you go over to the show, you'll see the silver spiral painting from early on. The spiral has been there, but in this case, it's this action of what happens, this kind of constant revisiting of the grooves as the motor turns. And what is so critical, and I think has been very great to see Günther Uecker finally being recognized in this context, is he was in this very key early earth art show at Cornell University in 1969. So as that movement, if again, here comes another terminology, starts to emerge, he's not only recognized, he's present and a part of that conversation. And I think American art historians have really truly erased a lot of these European contributions. It was something I realized in starting to work on the material, and it's my crusade to get it back in. I think we're getting there. But I've been very happy to see him reclaimed into that moment. And I think, again, work like this has an effect on the viewer. It also relates to the floor in a way that early light discs did. So, in a way, there's a kind of circling or continuity, let's say, in the work, even if it takes a new direction. And around the same time in parallel, he begins doing these other series of actions that actually. So what I like about the sand spiral is it brings nature into the institution, but then at the same time, he was getting the heck out of the institution and going out and doing his own thing. And so you see something like Sandman or these different actions that he realized in Libya in 1974. I mean, I'm always amazed at the geography and the kind of vast reach of what he was doing. So there is this kind of turn, and I think it was important for me to. And it will be important for me to kind of begin to think about that later period, because so many things happen and there's so much engagement with history. But what I wanted to do, and I was talking with my colleagues here, is to share with you on the one hand that history, but also to start to think about where he may have infiltrated the system of art. And I began, because of my current role, which you announced, I've been thinking a lot about art in the United Arab Emirates. And Hassan Sharif is an artist who's born in the 50s and went to school in London. But by the early 1980s, he himself went back to Dubai, where he's from, and began a series of actions, or really actions for himself. It was about his engagement with not just with the environment, but with simple acts. And I think that's, thinking back to the 1961 performance on the street, that was a simple act, a simple insertion. That did have an audience. In Hassan's case, like these other cases that we saw in 74, there's a camera that's capturing that. But Hassan was also looking at everyday objects, and I think particularly of his ruler, this idea of kind of doing away with its possibilities. Certainly a lot of artists, it's not to say that Günther Uecker was the first to use everyday objects, but I know in talking to Hassan that he was aware of what Günther had done and very much liking this idea that there were these possibilities, because in his home country, calligraphic abstraction and some representational art was the norm. So I think that what he learned in Europe and what he brought home to the UAE was the possibility of a more conceptual practice, which is what Günther Uecker, well, he really did it from the beginning, but it certainly takes off in a period when artists like these are coming of age. And, you think back to Uecker's early objects, and I was, of course, I always think about the objects from 63, 64, but as early as 1961, he makes this piece. And I think one of the things I'm struck by is there's always with the nails, there's also, on the one hand, a very strong attraction and a repulsion, a fear of that surface. And in studying this, because Hassan, it's a little more of an ideational relationship, I started thinking about other artists, and this is one of the early cases too, where this piece is actually in the Peggy Guggenheim collection, and Peggy bought it out of that 1964 McRoberts and Tunnard show. But this idea of the touch, what is the relationship to the surface, and I began to think about other contemporary artists, and I'm going to now take you on my speculative journey. This is the shift. To talk about Mona Hatoum, because I actually think you're going to be quite surprised, as was I, some of the affinities, let's call them, that one can discern. Already by the well, first of all, Mona, also like Hassan Sharif, although herself Lebanese, a Palestinian, but born in Lebanon, I should say, studied in London, and in the early years of her practice, she became really engaged with performance, which of course it was in the air in the 70s, 80s. But she also was very frustrated by the lack of the reference to the body in European art. So we'll see in a minute how that may play out. But like Uecker, she took the everyday object, the object that you might pull out of your kitchen, and she made it somewhat threatening. She certainly changed the way, and the title here is very clear, No Way. And one of the things she was thinking about here is those things that block passage, because obviously these are open. And for her, because of her experience of coming from a country with civil war, there's a very clear politics, but she kept saying, well, everybody in the West is always talking about World War II. There are other wars. And I thought of how, of course, Günther Uecker and his generation came out of that experience of World War II, particularly in this country, but all over Europe. But he's never forgotten that there are wars other places. He's never forgotten through to today all these different references. And so I thought, my goodness, he's absolutely the opposite of what Mona thought European art was as a student. She began, by the 1980s, making works like her very iconic The Light at the End, which, I'm just going to toggle a bit, has great, clear formal affinities to someone like Dan Flavin. But those are not neon tubes. They are heating elements. And so what she wanted to do is to begin to turn what we think of as the minimalist, formalist language on its head and start to suggest this threat. Well, early on, Günther Uecker made this great piece, which, okay, maybe, I would be threatened by it. I don't know if you would be. But, it's beautiful. It has many things happening. But there's that tension, right, in the work, the tension that it's not just about what you're looking at. It's what may go beyond. And then Mona, thinking a bit about, let's say, the history of carpets from the region, but she began to make a series of carpets, including doormat, which on the one hand is, of course, looking at this legacy of the floor of someone like Carl Andre. But on the other, there's certainly other people that were looking at that principle here. Floor sculpture, I think back to that first image of Günther Uecker standing in the corner on those nails. That's a pretty precarious place. And so when you look at a detail of pin carpet, yes, it's denser. Yes, it's got a different reference point. But definitely his brand of a reduced art, let's say, is very close. And I had taken this out, but then when I came today to see the show, I put it back in. But Hatoum made this barbed wire piece. We have one of them in the Guggenheim, New York, hanging from the ceiling, which, okay, on the one hand is definitely looking at penetrables of Soto. But on the other hand, I kept thinking, and then there's light rain. So there's this kind of different light rain. Also, I was thinking of the hanging structure having relationship to Soto, but doing something completely different, having that fluorescent tubing that becomes the signature of Dan Flavin, but doing something really different. So I guess, again, there's not these direct links, but I do have a pretty good one. Actually, what happened, what sort of jogged my memory on this was in the middle of the exhibition tour with my chief curator, Nancy Spector, we came upon, I'll do this just for 1 minute. That's a good one. I guess I'll stick on that one. We came upon the sand mill that I showed you earlier, and she said, I wonder if Mona Hatoum knew Günther Uecker. Well, it's very interesting because in her case, it is a turning blade. But on the one hand, in this case, one creates form and one takes it away. It's like it comes out of an early student work that lives on the border between what Günther Uecker did and Rauschenberg's Erase de Kooning, because it is about creating the mark and taking away the mark. But it's that threat of erasure, which I think is present in some of the other work. But I mean, you know, we obviously are looking at a beautiful sand spiral here, but there other ones had knives and had this kind of element of threat, but also kind of also creation, using these tools as destructive tools as creation. And of course, the knife appears in other works that we see one here in the context of the Terror Orchestra. So to me, it was a very, to summarize, I thought it was very interesting. And I'm not saying I'm decided on, I have a ruling on this, but now I really want to know more. And I'm going to definitely talk to Mona Hatoum and ask her if there's any chance that she had seen Günther Uecker's work. But I do think he is her predecessor. He is to her work what those Americans never could be, because he also is someone who has gone inside the cultures of loss around the world and the culture of reflection and of contemplation, which I think is extremely meaningful. The other thing that I'd never really been thinking about is musicality in the work, and I know, you know, many of you will know that Günther Uecker had known John Cage, had done homages to Cage, and there are many works that kind of engage either directly or indirectly with musicality. And of course, the dancing. I'm just showing the piano just to reference that, but obviously the unobvious, let's say, sound engagement is the Terror Orchestra piece that's on view here now. And I basically came to speak with Mohammed Kazim, who's a slightly younger generation of artists in the UAE. And he said, not only did he's a student of Hassan Sharif, and he not only did he say, oh, I know Uecker's work, he said, well, his show, that he was in a show that came to Sharjah in the UAE, and that was absolutely critical for him. These are his scratch pictures, so white monochromes. He uses scissors to create the forms. And he said, I understood, not that I'm copying Uecker, not that I'm doing the same thing, but we're living inside a very similar spirit. We're trying to bring these things out, and one of the mark and the physicality of the creation was important. Muhammad also has done performance, but actually for him, it's sound. And he said that was something that the musicality, the rationalization of that, or the presentation of that he saw in Günther Uecker is part of his thinking for, this is not a realized project, but for the idea that you could walk inside a room and the language that you're seeing is multiple languages, and the soundtrack is meant to be that of people in different languages speaking inside a bar. And I thought this is a really interesting connection because, of course, what is so fantastic is Günther Uecker is always inside his art, but he's also always inside life. He's always inside everything that's kind of going on, and there's a convergence that happens, this kind of magic poetry of immersion. So hearing a younger artist from a completely other side of the world cite him directly, I know that, again, it's not, he has had an influence. He's had an influence that goes well beyond the borders of this city. But I was thinking today, and it's sort of a way of personally ending it all up. This is us in New York, with wonderful Christine with us, and Jacob. You know, Günther Uecker, as I said in starting, remains a citizen of the world, and we were just incredibly fortunate that he was willing to come to us in New York. He also brought me here because we had a lot of good conversations here. So I think that he is a person that is convening. He's bringing people to your city. He's coming to our cities, and he's giving back. And I think really the exhibition that we realized in New York could have never been what it was without him. And so I guess in the end of the day, what the exhibition here captures is it definitely captures those early years, which I'm obviously obsessed with because I spent the first half hour talking about it. But it also captures what happened after and what's happening now. And what I think is incredibly important to say, which we talked about many times, is a lot of us are making historic exhibitions, and we're using labels and terms. And they were okay in the time, but at the same time, Günther Uecker is a living contemporary artist and one of the great ones, and he's not stopping. He has another Shiraz project coming up. So I think we're very lucky if once in a lifetime we meet someone that takes us on that journey, and certainly I can say that he took me on. He's still taking me on a journey. He brought me back here this time for this show, and you did too. But anyway, just to close out by saying, from the beginning, Günther Uecker was engaged internationally. He was present internationally, and I am certain that will never stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you so much, Valerie, to interpret the essential.
It's always so nervous.
Essential. The essential speaking over my work. That's so grateful. I hear you, and you have clear thinking in connection to international spiritual exercising. And so what they exercise.
Thank you.
What we're doing as an artist. And so I'm very hopeful you are here and very happy.
Thank you.
And thank you for that. What you say.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's the greatest compliment.
And thank you too. Thank you so much to invite Valerie.
Thank you, Valerie, so much also from my side. And so we came to I can say, to many results. So we both had this impression that he had such a strong international reception, and he has such a strong reception on the contemporary artists worldwide. But so your lecture has been so rich. I have some comments, and then perhaps you can open it up to the audience. So first I want to say that, can you hear me? Is it strange? Yeah, okay. It's a bit. That I liked very much your idea of the concept of freedom. So I really like this expression that Uecker followed a concept of freedom, and that you told us the story of Thwaites who did something like an excommunication because he didn't fit the labels. And we found, Stefanie Jensen and me, that the reception in the United States in the early 60s till this solo exhibition in 68 is not so much described in the literature. Right. So it was very difficult to reconstruct these. How was the reception of the audience in the United States? How the people discussed the work of Günther Uecker and the young artist? What did he do exactly in these years? And then he came back to Düsseldorf and founded Cream Cheese, and he was a different person when he came back from the United States, where he met Warhol and so. So it's missing in a way, this in the literature on Uecker. I want to make a comment. I read that Frank Lloyd Wright planned first to have red walls. Is it true? In the Guggenheim, New York. And I like this idea. I think it was a bright red wall. So like Uecker started with red and blue and yellow, and then, if it's true, I don't know, but under the influence of Hilary Bay, he decided to change to white. So I found it interesting because it was between 56 and 59. And then I thought, there's a famous essay on this reception of Zen Buddhism for the generation of American artists, especially the expressionist abstraction and informel, and so. I think of Panofsky. Is it Panofsky? I can't remember. I read it during my study. How can you compare this reception of Günther Uecker of Zen Buddhism and the Zero artists Pine and Mack, and this Zen reception in the United States? It was a few years later in America, I think. Sorry, I have some comments, but it's better to do it in the home. Another thought I had when we prepared this exhibition here in the K20 on the sculptures who came from the Düsseldorf Academy with Tony Craggs 2 years ago. We found out that Yayoi Kusama doesn't exist here in the discussion. So we didn't know that Yayoi Kusama came here to this region, to Düsseldorf. She went to the studio of Christian Megert. I think she started with the mirror installations before Megert. And after my opinion, she had quite a strong influence on the artists here. So I want to hear your opinion. And my last comment, that I think that the whole story of the reception of Günther Uecker worldwide is not written yet. So we had these experimental projects with the young curators from many other countries, and they described how the influence of Uecker was very strong in Russia, in different generations, in China, and so on. But exactly to feel what happened with the artworks. So I think we have no idea yet. And when we had this project with Valerie Hillings in the last month, and we produced the third part of Cabaret Crusades, the first thing which Valerie Hillings told us, oh, Günther Uecker is living here. He was the most important artist for me in my study in Egypt. Yeah. And so I think there's a new chapter still open for us. So sorry that I had so many comments.
I'll try to tie it together. I mean, I think you're definitely right. And I was what struck me in your essays in the new Uecker Zeitzonen is what I think probably everybody in this room and everywhere, there are exhibitions that we see that we never forget and change what we think. And I think that the show in Moscow that Günther Uecker had has to have been understood and absorbed by artists and other people that we haven't yet touched on or grabbed. Same thing in Poland. I mean, all these different countries. I mean, obviously the Chinese essay really kind of starts to get at that. Hearing the Wiles said that is really interesting, and especially now thinking about what I'm beginning to interrogate myself in the part of the Arab world that I'm looking at. So I think that you're right. That will start to materialize and become clearer, but it hasn't really been written. So that's a gap in the literature at this point, because there's so much that's tied to the past, and it's the future that I think is going to be interesting. I cannot take credit for freedom. That came from Günther Uecker. He has said that word to me so many times in the last number of years, and there are different kinds of freedoms that are implied by it that are embedded in the work. But it's powerful. It's definitely clear coming out of the experience of World War II, then going into the Cold War, and some of the projects certainly also tap into that. Other parts of the world where there were other wars in other places for other reasons. Freedom is always at stake, and different kinds of freedoms. And so I liked that. He also, the other two words that he gave to me in the journey were hopes and dreams. So, there's always the hope for something different. There are always the dreams, whether it's the visions of the artist or other human aspirations. And that's what I like about what's in the work, because when you begin to talk about Zen Buddhism, we're aware that, Günther Uecker is a great scholar of so many different schools of thought, religions, philosophies, and they all kind of merge into this amazing body of work that he's produced. There have been, in about, it's now been a long time, but there was a show at the Guggenheim called The Third Mind, where my colleague looked at the impact of Buddhist thinking on American art. And it was very wide-reaching, but it always matters what version of these things people were reading and absorbing. Was it the popular version? Was it what was it? And but I think that what Günther Uecker has been able to do is to orient away from some of the rationalist Western thinking into these other areas to really, I think, the Sufist thinking of contemplation. I mean, we were just talking tonight about contemplation, about in that 1959 party, being in the midst of red and blue, one can begin to contemplate, can begin to go into that space of light where it's kind of the dematerialized experience. So, and then in terms of the American criticism or writing, let's say, obviously around the time of these few exhibitions, there were writings. Donald Judd did a review in, I think it was Arts Magazine. Obviously, John Cannaday wrote about it in the New York Times. There were, many of these people were invested in the Europeans never making it across the border, to use my title. It was definitely a very strong sense, and where it really kind of came down, and where I see the historical marker, so I'm not going to answer your question directly, obviously, is with the Responsive Eye exhibition in 1965 at the Museum of Modern Art, which largely comes out of a discussion that William Zeitz has with Denise Renee, actually. But it's a show where a lot of these artists from this generation finally are shown, but the show is just destroyed by the critics. It's destroyed by the kind of progeny of Clement Greenberg on the saying it's all formalism, or it's too poetic, or all these different things. And so that's the moment that I see that as the moment where a lot of artists got written out of American version of art history, which is certainly not the only one. And it's really, I think there were a lot of reasons for that, and some of them you might we might never touch. But yeah. So I also agree with you. I haven't even myself. When I've read that literature, I've been reading it with the eye of someone who was working on artist groups in Zero. Now I would like to go back in and look at the Günther Uecker side, because particularly the 1966 show, I was struck. I went to the Howard Wise archive at Harvard University, and I saw these photos of Günther Uecker sitting in the garden, and then Yayoi Kusama standing there alone in her kimono. And so we're going to have to bother him about that at another time. But yeah, she was absolutely present. You know, her work was in Monochrome Amalur I. This is when a lot of people saw it for the first time, I think. And then ultimately is in the Stedelijk exhibition. She was in that photo from 1965. So she was on this continent. People were aware of her work, and I think but that's always a question, right? When and how were people aware of each other's work? Did it really help? I mean, when I say, to me for today, my illustration is light rain in that photo is not light rain in your museum. So there's, you know, there's that. But she was and I think for me, well, of course, I got the question, as you probably always do too. Well, were there any women in your show? So we had Kusama, we had Dadamoino, we had Nanda Vigo. You know, yes, these people are in that history. And I think there was a show a number of years back called Love Forever on Kusama, and in that, I think it was Laura Hopman wrote about this relationship to Zero and Kusama. But it didn't go as deep as I think people could go.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to open the discussion to the audience. And
maybe I would like to say something, not having a question, but what always strikes me, if we talk about Günther Uecker, it has to do with language and with speech.
Yes.
And you mentioned very often the word trans in your speech. Transmission,
yes.
transnatural, even transport, transforming, transfer, human behavior, and so on. And this is so striking because that's really something that he does. He starts with something, then it goes through a movement, through a thing, and it's transformed and put to something else. And that's just something that struck me, because you use this term so often. It is so natural.
That's so interesting. I'm glad to say. No, well, I mean, I was as I started out by speaking, this notion of the transcultural, which is getting, we've been having a lot of debates in my curatorial circle about, we started out thinking a lot about what is transnational, and then we realized that the problem with that, and this was brought to our attention by the scholar Gita Kapoor, national being in there talks about the nation state, and nation states have a way of changing, and they also have a way of not being the thing that's the most relevant, because in the case of, I think Günther Uecker is a good example of that. He's moving across these borders. He's moving, but he's really moving through and across cultures, and cultural references.
Nationalism is absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that's and doing it so early. You know, I mean, it's not that, look, it's not to say that artists didn't travel or meet other people in the world before the 1950s and 60s. I'm not saying that, but a lot of things made it easier. Yeah. You know, using trans again, you could transport the art in the magazines, and through letters and through word of mouth. And I think I over in the Zero Foundation's archive here in Düsseldorf, there's a book that Henk Peters had put together with photographs of the different artists' work that he would take as sort of his pitch book, an early pitch book to museums. That was a way of transmission. So, you know, what are the different forms? And then I really am so excited, we were talking about this today, how much actually is not lost to us because of the artist's willingness to engage with television, to get on TV, to talk to these perhaps a little bit not so supportive television magazine formats, but with their voiceovers, but they're not lost to time for us, and that's also transmitting across time and space. And what ends up being the challenge of a scholar is that because people like Günther Uecker were in so many countries, you have to go to so many countries' film archives to get these things. But they do have them, and I think that is part of the great plurality. The other thing that I was struck with in the exhibition today, and I'm always struck with Günther Uecker, is the piece with all the different languages on the wall. Yes. Because I remember going into a studio right before the Tehran show and seeing the pieces and sort of being amazed that here was this, you know, the script. And so I think language, literally language and other languages are really an important part of it too. The way the way everybody communicated, because I'm very lucky that he was willing to try to speak English to me. I can read German, I can't speak it. So when I met many of his colleagues, I found that one would speak one language, I would speak another, and I think that Uecker himself and Uecker and his generation were willing to do it. These letters, I mean, if you read them, if you're a native speaker and you read them, they're in not great form for French or English or what have you, but it does it. So that to me, that willingness to communicate was also the really key thing to reach out.
There comes another point I wanted to state, that in terms of that a younger generation, that we go forward and see forward. When you stated Mona Hatoum, she said there was World War II, but there were other wars, and there is also a generation that didn't experience this World War. And so when we talk about dialogue with different cultures, with religion, we also must be aware, and there's something that I personally learned from this exhibition, that we can't stop dialogues between generations. As long as we, as soon as we stop dialogue with generations, we cannot experience these heavy threats anymore. And threats is definitely something that's like injuries and compounds within the work of Günther Uecker.
Yes, and this kind of tension between life and death. Between these two possibilities, between human nature's desire to dance on the erupting volcano of life and to squash it at the same time. Yeah, for sure.
So anybody?
Thank you. I have a more general question about your hint about the criticism of the American way of art history. It sounded a little bit like self-criticism, and I'm wondering if you could tell us more if this is a trend in the United States today. And
I hope so. No,
if this is part of your crusade, this is part of your crusade,
it is.
That the fact that Uecker hasn't been exhibited for 50 years in the US, in the Guggenheim, is a symbol, for this dominance of American history. And I'm also wondering if one of the reasons for this kind of site you have is that the Guggenheim itself is now not only going transnational, but in a way of going to Islamic world, is itself going transcultural.
Sure.
And for this reason, you kind of have transcended your way of history also.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, one really interesting thing to note is actually the Guggenheim's history, especially in the 50s and 60s, is actually very rooted in this European generation. Thomas Messer, who was our director, who I know Günther Uecker knew well, was giving people like Paul Bergy full museum shows. Günther Uecker was in a show of drawings, I know, early on. Mach and Pina were chosen for the Guggenheim International in 1964, again, the watershed year. So what I actually was feeling, well, of course, I'd been at the Guggenheim then for 10 years, but I was feeling this sense that this exhibition belonged in this place, in this history, because Mr. Messer passed away a couple years ago, and I knew him, and I felt like he would be absolutely smiling down on us, that we were doing right by these artists, because he was always trying to do that. So that's just one piece of that puzzle. In terms of art history, I think my sense as I was studying, because I was not, there were a lot of artists that I call the October faction. They write for October magazine. Many of them, obviously, the likes of Rosalind Krauss and all, come out of Clement Greenberg. There's a very kind of formalist view. There's a particular politics. I wasn't really studying under those people, although I did take some of their classes. And I began, I guess because I had studied Russian art history also, I was looking at all these things that were a little bit on the border, on the periphery. And I began to realize what wasn't there, because I was really lucky in undergraduate. I had a professor who was working on Fluxus. And so I was already kind of looking at that context of multinational crisscrossing. But she had a textbook that actually had a section on kinetic art. And so I was lucky to get that, but it was just missing everywhere. And then when I started teaching at New York University, I thought, well, I want to put all these people in my talk. And so I guess in going into that history and actually coming and meeting with all of them here in Europe, all over Europe, because my dissertation looked at Grave in Paris, it looked at Gruppo N and Gruppo T in Italy, at Exat 51 in Zagreb, at Equipo 57 in Cordoba. So I was really I was doing it too, which was a weird dissertation. Nobody understood what I was like on the job market. They said, but what do you do, Well, I like everything. No, I mean, it's a very clear chapter, but I think I began to kind of figure out in talking to these artists that I was one of the only Americans who'd ever come on their doorstep. And so I was kind of I asked myself about that. And I just had to begin. I mean, certain artists, of course, I mean, we knew about Tanguy, about Yves Klein. These are artists that were in everything, but a lot of the other artists that were great and are great artists were just nowhere to be found. And I had to think, because they came out at that moment when New York was really defining the art world, when minimalism and then conceptual art then, of course, crosses the border over here into Germany as well. I just kind of wondered if it wasn't because it didn't fit into that story of how New York stole the art world, to borrow Serge Guilbeault's phrase. So I guess it's just been an instinct, and then I think I've been excommunicated. Oh, I just want to correct one thing. John Anthony Thwaites didn't excommunicate. He said they were excommunicated by the Nouvelle Tendance artists. I think that's an important point. And the Nouvelle Tendance operators they had these coordinators. So one was Julio Leparc, I think Van Grevenitz was one of them. So there are all these different artists that begin to be part of this committee. And it's run kind of like a committee thing, and they were ruling people in and out. So, but I used to spend a lot of time with the Nouvelle Tendance artists. I don't know if now that I did the Zero show, if that will still happen. Things run deep. No, but I actually realized they had a kind of not conference in 2004 in Novigrad. And there were a couple of British artists there, and I've never really studied British art. Full disclosure on that's my weakness, but they actually knew my work, and I had written in an essay in LACMA's Beyond Geometry catalog that kind of throwing down this theory that the Americans wrote the Europeans out, and they thanked me for it because they felt that that was their impression as well. So, you know, what I think is happening in art history, and this now will connect to your question about the Arab world. We're all beginning to realize that we only have seen certain chapters. There are all these other chapters that are out there that actually might relate to one another in a really exciting way. So a lot of art historians are beginning that process. The problem is being able, back to this plurality question, being able to understand all of those contexts when you don't either have the language or the real, or you're coming as an outsider in, which was always the challenge I had with the Russians. They didn't really understand why I thought I could do Russian art. Which is kind of fair and not. And so I think for me now, what I'm in the process of doing is looking back. I'm, as you can tell, focused a lot on the 50s and 60s. What happens to that story if you bring more of these artists back in? If you go and say, I'm now going to be obsessed with this Taipei thing, now that we've talked about it. I'd never really, I didn't know it till last night. And I think those are the things that are going to get us really excited, because we're going to see how things changed in ways that we don't know at all right now. But I hope generationally art historians, not just Americans, are going to do this.
Valerie, I think we'll let you relax now after your long flight, but I want to ask you as a last question. So this research on Zero and Günther Uecker, I think it did influence you in a way. So we can say it for us. We learned many things. We were strongly influenced by this work. And so Stephanie said that you used always the word trans. And in your vision for Abu Dhabi, I thought that you described your trans-cultural vision, and perhaps to give a remark to the end, because we are very curious to know something about it. Did your concentration on Zero and Günther Uecker influence you in a way for your future work to develop a concept for Abu Dhabi?
Sure. Well, we're really lucky to be in the position of thinking about an institution that doesn't exist yet. Really, it's. I mean, how many times in one's lifetime can you form a new canon? It's a hard job. But yes, absolutely. Working on Günther Uecker, working on Zero, working on all those artist groups, it reminded me to not close yourself off to those different connections. The question about the Guggenheim is a good one, because we were founded, obviously, as a museum of non-objective painting that was very much European and American focused. We did here and there pick up, some Japanese art and a few other things, but that was really the focus. Equally the focus when we opened the museum in Bilbao, although there was a focus on Basque artists. So what has gradually been happening before the advent of Abu Dhabi is that the Guggenheim became more global under Thomas Krenz, began to look at other places, and so some of this art started to come into our system. You know, we did a Sai Kuo Chang retrospective and so on, just one example. And so by the time we got to this idea of this new museum in a part of the world that's different, we thought, well, what is really relevant? And part of what's really relevant, of course, is to look at the art from that place, but at the same time, we started debating, we decided to start the collection in the 1960s because we do feel, or I think you could have said late 50s, there's this pivotal moment that we've been talking about tonight where things start to open up and change. Where now it's you know, the best example I can give is when we do a presentation on one of the artists, you can no longer just say born Paris 19 whatever. You need to say born, lives in, works in, you know, because really people are not staying in one place. A residency might take them to Düsseldorf, but they're from Egypt or what have you. So we felt that there was an opportunity. I felt, because of my training, to rethink the canon, to really make ourselves know the chapters that were always there that we didn't know. And I've been, you know, my re-education, as I call it, I'm discovering artists that were someone like Ibrahim Salahi, who and you know, an African artist who was also in Europe. He lives in England now, but was also spent in 1964. Comes to New York and makes amazing paintings with spray paint. Iraqi modernism that really engages the calligraphic, but is also looking at this kind of some of these principles. I was thinking today in Uecker's show about this principle of contemplation and repetition of zikr. You know, so I guess there aren't that many chances in your lifetime to think about the broader picture. So I think for us, that's what has been the gift of this future museum, is that opportunity to open it up and test a lot of things. But in so doing, one expects to have some hard lessons, so we're prepared. What I can share with you, which I think is relevant for us tonight, we have currently on view in a temporary space in Abu Dhabi an exhibition called Seeing Through Light. I began work on that initially, but then with zero, I had to give something up, so my colleagues took it forward. But it's a very small exhibition drawn from the nascent and not totally public yet, but now some of it, a collection of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, and it is looking at precisely these artists. There's an Autopina Light Ballet, there's Heinz Max Stellen, because of course, and you saw the dancer, so you can tell I got some zero into the collection, so that was a goal, and it's happened. But there's also a mirror room, infinity mirror room from Kusama. There's a light picture from Doug Wheeler. There's a light and music piece inspired by Egyptian Shabi music by Hassan Khan. Angela Bullock Pixel Box. So we're beginning to start to say what happens if you put these things together. And the problem, and the most important thing I would say in concluding that, is you don't want to just use formal affinities. I mean, I did that a little bit tonight. I cheated a bit with the Mona Hatoum thing, but that's now I got to do the homework. But you can't forget these individual chapters and just put them together because they look alike. So we're really looking at true histories that overlay, but yes, some of the affinities can be part of what you're looking at. And the first exhibition there seems to have worked well. People have been very receptive to it. And I think what I also liked about it, and I see linked to what we've spoken about with Uecker this evening, is that impulse to make art an experience and to engage the viewer, and not just to be about looking at representation. That is something that's born in the 60s, and it's alive in contemporary art. And so that won't be everything we do, but I think that the first test run has gone okay.
After your talk, we are even more curious and looking forward to 2017. We hope so. And thank you so much again. And you're going directly back to Abu Dhabi? Is it? Well,
I'm going there for half of March. So, but March, excited to be here tonight, and always glad to come home to Düsseldorf. I never thought I would come here so many times in my life, but thank you for giving me another reason to be here.
So come back very often. You're always.